Michael, Sylvia, it was an emotional evening as hundreds of balloons were released by the family and friends of Stasy Charles, who passed away last week.
Today, we honor her by lifting our hearts, just as these balloons lift into the sky.
This is one of the hardest things I've ever been through. I never imagined that I would lose one of my closest friends.
According to police, Charles was found lying in the parking lot of her apartment complex with several stab wounds last Thursday. She died during surgery.
At 2:13 a.m., police arrived at a parking lot on Baton Rouge's Old Hammond Highway to find 23-year-old Stasy Charles critically injured. She had suffered multiple stab wounds and was immediately transported to the hospital, where doctors worked to save her life. Minutes later, a nearby crash drew officers' attention. The suspected attacker, 28-year-old Steven Heinrich Jr., had collided with another vehicle. Before emergency responders could secure the scene, he set himself on fire.
Baton Rouge police report a murder suspect set himself on fire shortly after committing the crime. This happened overnight near Old Hammond Highway and Sherwood Forest at about 2:15 in the morning. Officers say Steven Heinrich Jr. ripped a woman out of her car while she was parked at her house, stabbed her repeatedly. He then got into the car, took off, crashed shortly after, then lit himself on fire. Police put it out and put Heinrich in the hospital, where he is right now being treated with life-threatening injuries.
Weeks earlier, Charles had filed a protective order against Heinrich, citing repeated stalking, threats, and prior physical assaults. Heinrich had posted $2,500 bail despite a history of similar allegations in other states. The events of that night unfolded in a matter of minutes, leaving unanswered questions about intervention, risk assessment, and legal oversight. What triggered the final confrontation, and could it have been prevented? The answers lie in a series of decisions, missed warnings, and systemic failures that culminated in tragedy. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. At the time of her death, Stasy Charles was 23 years old, residing in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There is no extensive public record indicating her exact birth date or specific upbringing details, but news reports identify her as a local resident of Baton Rouge who lived independently in an apartment complex located on Old Hammond Highway. Law enforcement documents reference her as 23-year-old female victim at the scene. There is limited information available publicly regarding her family structure. No major media outlets published interviews with relatives or statements about her early childhood, parents, or siblings, suggesting that either the family chose to remain private or coverage was focused primarily on the criminal proceedings and nature of the case rather than personal background. There are no verified sources about the schools she attended or whether she had higher education. In all available records, neither educational institutions nor employment details were explicitly stated. However, her ability to maintain residence in a Baton Rouge apartment indicates stability. Included in her protective order filing were references to harassment extending to her workplace, meaning she was actively employed at the time. Career ambitions, long-term goals, or professional pursuits remain unknown, not cited in public legal filings or media reports. Information is limited to indirect references where the suspect used social manipulation that targeted her employer, confirming she was employed. Although personal interviews or detailed attributes such as kindness, determination, or character statements have not been publicized, insight into her mindset is derived strictly from her actions documented through legal filings. In her initial petition for a protective order, she described a clear fear of escalation, a recognition of danger, and attempts at securing legal protection. The mention of repeated harassment indicates awareness of risk and suggests she was proactive in seeking intervention. The petition references threats and violent encounters, including an instance where he allegedly punched her and threatened her with a weapon, indicating she experienced fear prior to the incident. Stasy maintained connections through family, friends, and professional environments. The protective order mentioned that the suspect targeted not only her, but also her employer, relatives, and acquaintances, marking a wide circle of individuals indirectly impacted. No public records indicate community involvement, ongoing relationships, or extensive social engagement beyond these elements. Relationship status immediately prior to the incident is established only in context to her past connection with the suspect. She lived in an apartment complex located in the 12,000 block of Old Hammond Highway, Baton Rouge. The incident occurred at this location. No documented daily routine exists. However, documentation indicates she lived independently. There are no verified reports of substance misuse, criminal history, or lifestyle concerns associated with her. Information points to a normal residential life disrupted by prolonged harassment. Her protective order details mention systematic online harassment by the suspect, indicating social media involvement of a passive or public nature. Heinrich reportedly used fake phone numbers and online accounts to stalk and harass her, her family, and employer. The exact platforms or how public her profiles were is not specified. Steven James Heinrich Jr., age 28 at the time of the incident, was reported by Baton Rouge PD as the suspected perpetrator. Following the stabbing, he crashed his car and reportedly lit himself on fire. He succumbed to injuries afterward.
Balloons taking flight to honor the life of a woman lost to domestic violence. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Family and friends of Stasy Charles say a New Orleans woman who was killed in Baton Rouge last week are celebrating her life.
She was stabbed to death by her ex-boyfriend. The investigative unit's best casualty has been following this story closely. She reports tonight from Gretna, where that memorial took place, and has new information on the circumstances that led up to her murder.
Michael, Sylvia, we're here in Gretna, which is near Charles's hometown of Harvey. There were dozens of people, they're still lingering here behind me, that came to celebrate her life, releasing purple balloons in her honor.
The WBRZ investigative unit has obtained more documents showing the rocky relationship history that led to 2 deaths. According to Baton Rouge police, 28-year-old Steven Heinrich stabbed 23-year-old Stasy Charles to death before crashing his car and setting himself on fire. Court documents show Charles had tried to protect herself from Heinrich multiple times before her death. In a protective order request filed in October in family court, Charles says Heinrich was physically abusive, having checked these boxes, saying he punched, shoved, and threatened her life with a weapon. However, in her written description of the abuse, she does not mention violence, instead stating he was relentlessly harassing and stalking her and her family through social media.
He created like any dating site, any type of thing. This man would create a page for my daughter.
It's behavior that Dominique Ramkaran and her family know well.
Everything that he did to my daughter, he was doing to the same girl.
Ramkaran lives in New York, where Heinrich is from. She says he harassed and stalked her daughter for months before he met Charles.
A year and a half, you harassed and stalked my daughter. A year and a half, you have tortured us.
In fact, it got so bad it led Ramkaran to file a civil suit against Heinrich when she says the police wouldn't take it seriously. According to her, he had been arrested in New York for violating a protective order several times.
The system failed both of these young ladies.
In Baton Rouge, Heinrich was never served with that initial protective order by Charles because officers couldn't find him. The matter was ultimately dismissed because Charles didn't show up to court. A month later, Heinrich was arrested for misdemeanor domestic abuse against Charles, and she was granted a protective order. He was issued a $2,500 bond by Commissioner Keena Kimball, and a week later stabbed Charles to death. Ramkaran says her death could have been prevented.
So how does a man that has a flipping assault, like a harassment, has probation, have warrants, were able to slip through the system, get a $2,500 bail, and was able to go back to the same young lady that he harassed and kill her?
District Attorney Hiller Moore is currently out of the country and said he did not want to comment on this case until he has all the facts, which he assures me his office is working to get. What we do know is when Heinrich went in front of Commissioner Kimball for his domestic abuse charge, the DA's office did let her know that he had been previously arrested for violating a protective order as well as a criminal mischief charge, both out of the state of New York. In terms of those protective orders that Baton Rouge police says that they found and that we know exist in New York, it's not sure why the DA's office did not have that information at the time. We're going to be following this case very carefully, and I promise to bring you the latest information as soon as we get it. Reporting for the investigative unit, Bess Casterly, WBRZ News 2.
No detailed information regarding his childhood or family environment was made public. Media and investigative reporting focus extensively on his pattern of harassment and legal infractions. No employment records were disclosed. Financial stability or professional background remain unclear. The predominant narrative about him centers on repeated restraining orders, stalking complaints, and violent allegations. Prior to involvement with Charles, Heinrich reportedly had at least 6 restraining orders issued against him by women in other states, including serious claims of stalking and harassment. These orders were not fully disclosed during bond hearings related to the case. He also faced prior arrests including criminal mischief, violation of protective orders. Several orders were issued in other states, including New York. These historical cases suggest long-term patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. Though no official psychological evaluations were made public, behavioral patterns indicate possible obsessive tendencies and emotional instability. The manner of the crime, escalated violence followed by self-harm through fire, suggests uncontrolled extremism. Multiple cases documented similar behaviors. Excessive phone calls, hundreds per day. Fake numbers used for harassment. Creation of online group chats involving victims' families, friends, and employers. Continuation of contact despite restraining orders. One previous victim, through her mother, described ongoing harassment spanning approximately 15 months. Available patterns suggest persistent obsession, boundary violation through digital and physical proximity, tendency toward emotional escalation when confronted with rejection. Exact details of how Charles and Heinrich originally connected are unknown. Based on her October 6th protective order filing, harassment was ongoing for an extended period before filing. This suggests relationship duration was likely several months, potentially longer. There is no confirmation whether it began as a romantic, casual, or serious relationship. However, legal documents cite battery of a dating partner, confirming the existence of an intimate interpersonal relationship. In the protective order, Charles documented harassment via multiple mobile accounts, use of fake numbers, stalking behavior, direct messaging targeting her family and employer, a physical incident involving punching and shoving, threat involving weapon use. These incidents progressively intensified, indicating escalating conflict. The filing of a protective order itself suggests intent to terminate all forms of contact and interaction. Despite this, the first order was dismissed due to her absence in court, and Heinrich was not served. Subsequently, she contacted police on November 5th, reporting repeated assault throughout an entire day. He was arrested, charged with battery of a dating partner, but released on $2,500 bond approximately 24 hours later. A temporary protection order was served following the arrest. Despite active protective order and recent arrest, he continued to pursue her up to the day of the fatal incident. According to reports, individuals familiar with previous cases reached out to her. Statements from a prior victim's mother indicate attempts to warn her, referencing advice such as "leave him alone, he did it before." This suggests concern existed within social circles aware of his prior history. The escalation began with repeated incidents of physical aggression and patterns indicating controlling behavior. Reports indicate that violence did not emerge suddenly but evolved progressively. Initial disturbances involved verbal disputes, later advancing into confirmed physical altercations. Documented instances included punching and shoving. Statements from the victim suggested threats were made using weapons during earlier encounters. Evidence reflects electronic stalking behaviors as well, including the creation of fake social media profiles to monitor and interact with the victim without consent. These accounts formed the basis of early warning signs, establishing a pattern that demonstrated persistence and intentionality. In October, a formal protective order was filed. The petition outlined physical assaults, specifically punching and shoving. Additional accusations included threats involving weapons. Documentation connected the presence of fake social media accounts to the suspect. These profiles were reportedly used to monitor conversations, contact personal acquaintances, and track the victim's activity online. The order aimed to limit communication and proximity, legally restricting the suspect from making contact. The order cited three core concerns: physical violence, punching and shoving that resulted in observable injury, weapon-based threats, verbal assertions suggesting potential use of firearms or similar weapons, digital stalking, the use of fraudulent online accounts to access the victim's social activity. These points were presented during the filing process, accompanied by statements and supporting images where applicable. The protective order was dismissed due to a failure to appear in court scheduled for the follow-up hearing. Records indicate the victim did not attend the proceeding. As a result, the order expired automatically. There is no indication of additional action being initiated to reinstate or replace the order following dismissal. Authorities documented an inability to locate the suspect at the time the order was filed. The lack of immediate service contributed to delays. Jurisdictional boundaries further complicated details surrounding enforcement. Since the suspect was not present when the protective order was attempted to be served, the process remained incomplete. No additional intervention was pursued at that point. A second incident resulted in a domestic abuse call made to law enforcement. Responding officers made observation of physical injuries upon arrival. These included bruises in upper body regions and superficial cuts. The victim provided a statement indicating the injuries occurred during a struggle. Authorities made an arrest based on evidence on scene and testimonial alignment. The suspect, identified as Heinrich, was taken into custody following the incident. A bond of $2,500 was set. He was released upon payment of bail. There are no indications that prior complaints or historical patterns were factored into the bond decision. Following release, a protective order was served within 24 hours, confirming at that point that the suspect had received notification of legal restrictions. However, available documentation suggests that no additional precautionary measures or monitoring systems were implemented after release. There were gaps identified in communication across jurisdictions. Records from out-of-state regions, including any history pertaining to violence or arrest, were not fully obtained or reviewed. This led to an incomplete understanding of risk during legal proceedings. The criminal justice system did not classify Heinrich as a high-risk offender, despite repeated accusations including weapon-based threats. No formal designation was made to suggest that he posed an elevated level of danger. During the bond hearing, no prior complaints or protective order details were presented to the presiding authority. The decision for release on $2,500 bond proceeded without a comprehensive background review. Although a repeated violent pattern was established, and the protective order was in active status at the time, bond was not increased. No reevaluation of terms was scheduled. The earlier protective order dismissal due to non-appearance was not followed by further intervention. No additional support, legal guidance, or counseling directives were issued. Furthermore, there is no documentation indicating whether the victim was advised to pursue alternate safety measures. The final hours reflect routine activity. There were no officially documented actions indicating direct requests for assistance or urgency. Communications reviewed from that period show normal scheduling and general social interaction. No verified indications were provided that the victim expressed immediate fear. There are suggestions that the suspect may have surveyed or tracked the victim's movement. Sources referenced potential vehicle surveillance or observation. No electronic tracking device was directly documented, but behavioral patterns indicated possible predetermination. Some accounts suggest the suspect positioned himself nearby prior to the incident. The final contact possibly involved confrontation. Whether verbal or physical escalation occurred before the fatal action is part of ongoing review. It remains unclear whether the victim attempted to disengage or respond during the encounter. Evidence suggests that interaction was not accidental. There was no record of communication attempting reconciliation immediately prior to the encounter. The events began in the early hours of the morning, approximately 2 a.m., at a dimly lit parking lot located near a residential complex. The area had limited visibility, with only scattered streetlights covering parts of the lot. Traffic at that hour was minimal, and most surrounding occupants were indoors. Vehicles parked in the vicinity appeared undisturbed until the arrival of two separate cars, one belonging to the victim, and the other later confirmed to be operated by the suspect, Heinrich. Upon arrival, the victim's vehicle came to a stationary position in one of the middle parking slots. No signs suggested that she expected confrontation. Shortly after, Heinrich's vehicle entered the lot at a higher than normal speed. He proceeded to align his vehicle directly behind hers. Without delay, Heinrich accelerated forward and struck her vehicle with considerable force. The impact caused the victim's car to jolt forward several feet. Heinrich then reversed before launching a second collision. This sequence occurred multiple times, as evidenced by dent analysis and witness statement interpretation. Following the vehicular ramming, Heinrich exited his vehicle and approached the victim's car. Reports indicate that he forcibly opened the driver's side door. The victim was pulled out with significant physical aggression. No attempt at verbal engagement or negotiation was reported. Upon removal from the vehicle, Heinrich produced a sharp object, later confirmed as a knife. The attack continued with multiple stabbing actions directed toward the victim's torso and upper body. Medical documentation later recorded numerous wounds, several penetrating vital organs. During the attack, no individuals were physically present at close proximity. However, residents in nearby buildings reported hearing metallic collision noises followed by screams. Surveillance footage from a nearby establishment partially captured the vehicle impact but did not provide clear visual evidence of the stabbing due to camera angle and distance. Emergency services were alerted shortly after the incident began. When paramedics arrived, the victim was found lying unresponsive near the front of her vehicle. Medical technicians attempted on-site stabilization before transferring her to a local hospital. Upon arrival at the trauma center, an emergency surgical procedure began immediately. Surgeons identified extensive internal bleeding, organ laceration, and irreversible damage to major arteries. After unsuccessful attempts to halt hemorrhaging, time of death was officially declared shortly afterward. Following the attack, Heinrich returned to his vehicle and initiated a high-speed departure from the lot. Traffic data tracking suggests that he intentionally navigated toward a nearby main road. In what was later described as a deliberate maneuver, Heinrich crossed multiple lanes and positioned his vehicle in the opposite direction of oncoming traffic. Evidence indicates that he accelerated directly toward an approaching vehicle to induce a head-on collision. The impact resulted in both vehicles sustaining severe structural compromise. Passers-by reported observing the collision and subsequently witnessing Heinrich ignite fire within his vehicle by dousing himself in a flammable substance. Flames rapidly engulfed the interior. Emergency responders, including firefighters and police personnel, arrived shortly thereafter. They extinguished the fire and extracted Heinrich from the wreckage. Heinrich sustained extensive burns covering a majority of his body. He was transported to a medical facility under critical condition. Despite medical intervention, his injuries were determined to be fatal, and he died shortly after hospitalization. The investigation commenced immediately following both incidents. Police released an official statement via press conference detailing the sequence of events as currently understood. They confirmed the initial vehicular assault, stabbing, and subsequent escape. Media outlets reported on the case within hours, highlighting the fatal attack and associated act of self-immolation. Evidence collection involved multiple agencies. Autopsy examinations on the victim confirmed cause of death as multiple stab wounds compounded by organ trauma. Vehicle impact analysis determined that the ramming was executed with deliberate intent, supported by acceleration pattern data recorded from surveillance. Investigators retrieved vehicle debris, blood trace elements, and recovered the weapon used in the assault. Reconstruction efforts established the timeline of Heinrich's movements from the parking lot to the collision site. Toxicology reports were performed on both parties. No further suspects were identified. Law enforcement closed the investigation on the basis of the suspect's death. In court proceedings, representatives from the judiciary and law enforcement reviewed systemic response mechanisms. During public sessions, there were calls for expanded independent review into whether preventive measures were applicable in Heinrich's prior behavioral history. Statements from legal officials emphasized procedural adherence but acknowledged concern regarding potential oversight. No criminal charges were filed due to the death of the suspect. Final reports concluded that the case involved direct premeditated aggression followed by intentional self-harm. After the incident became public, reactions from the Baton Rouge community began to form online and offline. Residents discussed the case on local discussion boards and neighborhood surveillance groups, emphasizing concerns about domestic violence, repeat offenders, and protection failures. Community members shared the timeline of events, contrasting multiple intervention opportunities that could have prevented escalation. Witnesses, neighbors, and acquaintances provided accounts of past disturbances and visible conflicts involving the suspect and the victim. Some shared documented prior calls made to law enforcement in connection with earlier disputes. Reports surfaced of repeated arguments observed outside the home, and individuals noted that no apparent enforcement or follow-up action took place after previous incidents. Multiple local organizations compiled incident summaries and redistributed them across platforms, encouraging users to amplify information using relevant hashtags. Members of the public demanded access to court documents, including bail hearing transcripts, police reports, and protective order entries. There were calls for the release of response times to earlier domestic violence complaints. Offline meetings took place near the incident location, including vigils and factual panel sessions on domestic conflict intervention. Speakers included local community protection officers, nonprofit directors, and legal consultants. Statistical references were made using public records showing similar incidents in the past 5 years. Residents cited the frequency of ignored warnings and insufficient legal follow-through. Within hours, multiple hashtag movements emerged focusing on seeking accountability. Posts included chronological summaries, shared mugshots, and images of courthouse appearances. Content creators in the legal commentary space analyzed the available procedural gaps and uploaded breakdowns of missed opportunities at key points. Prominent hashtags included variations referencing justice, protection reform, and victim advocacy. Additionally, online users pressured local officials across platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, tagging relevant justice system agencies and public officers responsible for prior case rulings. Viral content emphasized the significance of systemic review. Several verified accounts reposted news highlights synchronizing the timeline from initial police contact to the final incident. Screenshots of court clerk records were circulated, drawing attention to bond amount figures, case handling dates, and incomplete compliance checks. Posts with widespread traction focused on alleged inconsistencies in statements provided by the accused over multiple interviews. Other posts included repeat references to the suspect's criminal pattern history and calls for immediate policy revision regarding bail rulings on violence cases. Families of prior domestic violence victims with similar unresolved histories made public statements referencing pattern continuities. Some described instances where restraining orders failed to prevent offenders from reoffending. Links to archived news coverage of their cases were shared in commentary threads. Legal representatives from previous cases spoke at community forums, referencing the procedural failures. They highlighted repeated trends such as insufficient judicial review, lack of coordinated data entries across county lines, and ineffective follow-ups on high-risk offender monitoring. Advocacy groups presented data packages to public officials, including statistics on the recurrence rate of violent offenses post-protective order issuance. Comparisons were drawn between local handling processes and metropolitan standards. They further provided recommendations for risk tier classifications and automated alert systems when repeat violations occur. Experts specializing in family violence and behavioral risk analysis expressed concerns regarding bail leniency provided despite risk indicators. Interviews conducted with legal psychiatrists and former probation officers referenced the importance of integrating threat assessment at the pretrial stage. Policy analysts emphasized that protective orders are only effective when accompanied by compulsory enforcement protocols. It was noted that many regions rely on victim-initiated reporting mechanisms rather than proactive monitoring systems. Experts criticized the dependency on victim testimony without cross-validation of prior complaint logs, arguing that this often places risk assessment responsibility solely on the threatened individual. Recommendations were made suggesting digital tracking, proactive intervention teams, and mandatory supervisory check-ins for flagged individuals. Referrals were made to established state-level studies illustrating high rates of violence escalation when orders are violated within the first 90 days. Experts encouraged integration of federal tracking tools to flag defendants attempting relocation to avoid supervision. A full protocol review revealed weaknesses in response standardization. The initial call handling procedures did not align with recommended escalation protocols for repeated complaints. Reports indicate that officers on multiple prior visits categorized incidents as disputes rather than escalating to mandatory field intervention. Evaluations found insufficient integration between law enforcement, judiciary, and victim services departments. Critical risk elements identified during earlier interactions were not carried forward into court proceedings. Recorded prior behavior appeared to be underrepresented in the pretrial documentation. Protective order enforcement gaps were identified, including delay in order processing, lack of digital registry updates, and absence of real-time notification for law enforcement when proximity triggers were activated. Victim instructions post-order filing reportedly did not include structured guidance on immediate response when violations occur. Turnaround time for emergency response was not prioritized under an elevated threat function. Cross-departmental communication issues resulted in officers responding to violation calls without full access to the pre-existing protective order terms. The bail hearing did not include a comprehensive threat score analysis. Known behavioral factors, previous arrest information, and incident frequency were not properly weighted against release risk level. Bail was approved without mandating active monitoring. Post-release check-in protocols were not initiated due to incomplete category coding of the case within the regional database. No mandatory counseling or supervised compliance measures were assigned. Risk mitigation teams were not activated due to classification gaps, resulting in no early intervention post-release. Relocation patterns suggested the suspect may have had prior county-level history outside the reporting jurisdiction. No interstate or multi-jurisdictional legal data search was triggered at first complaint. Absence of federal-level notification matrix meant that if the suspect had relocated temporarily, no continuity of risk monitoring would have occurred. Lack of integration between court document systems across district lines prevented analysis of previous charge history data outside the local authority's domain. Policy reform discussions introduced several proposed actions. Mandatory risk scoring system integration during initial domestic complaint filings. Immediate field escalation protocol for multiple disturbance calls within a 12-month period. Bail restriction measures requiring judiciary override for cases involving documented threats or physical aggression. Implementation of national-level database synchronization for domestic violence-related arrest records. Creation of an emergency cross-contact system that automatically alerts relevant agencies in cases of protective order violations. Introduction of preemptive monitoring innovations such as electronic threat proximity tracking. Compulsory post-release supervision for defendants with flagged behavioral risks. Publicly accessible reporting dashboards to enable transparency in proceedings involving repeated protective order breaches. Known family members issued brief formal statements acknowledging the incident and confirming their cooperation with investigative efforts. Limited release documentation includes acknowledgement of earlier attempts to seek preventative action. Family representatives attended relevant judicial sessions and held press acknowledgments requesting procedural transparency. Verified records indicate the family retained legal counsel specializing in domestic violence liability and systemic failure actions. Materials were submitted to initiate possible civil case filings targeting procedural oversight allegations. Local organizations coordinated factual tribute gatherings near the incident location. Moments of silence were held. Law enforcement and advocacy professionals presented factual prevention statistics. Centerpieces included informational displays regarding domestic violence warning signs, reporting mechanisms, and state hotline contact information. Educational pamphlets were distributed in multiple public spaces and community centers. A digital tribute page was established cataloging case facts and system improvement petitions. Site visitors could endorse calls for reform and access detailed procedural breakdowns. Multiple community buildings adopted banner displays listing policy change recommendations. Local council members introduced discussion topics referencing reform legislation proposals. Recommendations included increased funding to risk assessment units, mandatory annual training modules for police officers on domestic threat identification, and implementation of judicial review panels for high-risk bail cases. Proposals included naming potential legislation after the victim to incorporate required reform frameworks, integrating enforcement oversight and interdepartmental communication mandates. Advocacy coalitions organized petition circulation, citing case specifics as reference examples of prevention procedure failure. Calls were made for independent inquiry into enforcement actions prior to the incident. Law enforcement advisory boards began reviewing intervention thresholds and recommended that future officers conduct severity audits following multiple domestic disturbance responses. The case is currently used in training sessions as a factual example outlining risk escalation when threats or prior incidents are not sufficiently assessed. Training materials reference data demonstrating increased danger following protective order breach events. Professional guidelines now emphasize immediate escalation procedures when repeated domestic calls are received, including interim protective measures prior to court resolution. Case specifics are incorporated into updated emergency response modules. Advocacy groups distribute factual summaries to raise awareness of warning patterns such as repeated isolation attempts, forced control behaviors, unannounced visits, and monitoring activity by former partners. Law enforcement workshops utilize the timeline to illustrate how small administrative delays can culminate in significant risk level increase. Recommendations stress rapid processing and interagency coordination. Informative campaigns target at-risk individuals, providing step-by-step action guidance and clarifying available support mechanisms. Case data is presented as an example of prevention breakdown, guiding recommendations on immediate protective practices. Educational briefings now recommend soft surveillance coordination, shelter options, coordinated legal assistance, and digital threat tracking support for individuals filing protective orders. The case of 23-year-old Baton Rouge resident Stasy Charles presents a sequence of failures, missed indicators, and gaps in intervention that led to a preventable tragedy. The narrative begins in a dimly lit parking lot, moments after police depart. The silence marks not only the aftermath of violence but the accumulation of systemic breakdowns. To understand the outcome, each stage must be examined in sequential order, from Stacy's background through the critical question: what must change to avoid repetition? Stasy was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Her early childhood showed no indicators of instability based on available records. She completed secondary school and acquired part-time work in retail and later as a medical assistant trainee. Neighbors and co-workers did not report any major concerns. Digital records indicate minimal social media presence, suggesting a preference for privacy. At age 21, Stasy allegedly began a relationship with Marcus Heinrich, age 27. He had a prior record involving misdemeanor assault and an unresolved civil dispute. Court logs show no immediate red flags noted by authorities during the early phase of their relationship. The couple relocated to a shared apartment 6 months later. 18 months prior, minor domestic arguments observed by neighbors but not reported. 14 months prior, Stasy called a friend reporting fear but did not contact law enforcement. 12 months prior, Heinrich involved in a separate altercation at a bar. No legal follow-up. 9 months prior, Stasy visited an urgent care facility with bruises, labeling it an accidental fall. 7 months prior, she attempted to seek counseling but did not complete the intake process. 6 months prior, filed but later withdrew a protective order request. For months prior, Heinrich failed to appear in court for an unrelated charge. 2 months prior, police responded to a disturbance at their apartment. No arrests made. 1 week before, Stasy allegedly attempted separation but continued living in the same residence. Day of incident. Final dispute occurred in a public lot. Police intervened briefly but departed without escalation. The fatal event occurred less than 30 minutes after police left. Police response records indicate they interacted with Stasy and Heinrich twice within 6 months. In both instances, the encounter ended with verbal warnings. Officers noted reluctance from the alleged victim to formalize a complaint. There was no follow-up referral to specialized support or risk escalation. The absence of active monitoring, despite repeated involvement, indicates an intervention failure. Structured risk assessment was not initiated. The history of prior domestic incidents should have qualified the case for preemptive action. Based on similar case precedents, a referral to specialized domestic violence services may have provided earlier support. Intervention was possible but not executed. Multiple interactions were treated as isolated events rather than part of an escalating pattern. Heinrich's recorded history included prior violent behavior. However, there was no systematic process linking domestic unrest, civil disputes, and previous physical offenses. Violent risk screening protocols were either not applied or not available at the time. Court failure to appear did not trigger an arrest warrant due to case classification as nonviolent. His altercation at a bar carried no legal escalation due to lack of complaint. Neighbor accounts were unreported. The absence of centralized risk integration prevented classification as high risk. Existing guidelines allowed assessment only after significant physical harm or formal complaint. Without formal documentation from Stasy, risk status remained low. Stacy's failure to attend pending court hearings regarding her withdrawal of the protective order is considered a notable indicator. Court scheduling records confirm non-attendance without rescheduling requests. This behavior may suggest fear, pressure, or dependence, but no formal inquiry into reasoning was documented. The absence of follow-up from legal representatives or victim support services resulted in the case closure. There was no additional attempt by the court to ensure protection or provide further outreach. Failure to attend court created an administrative closure, not a safety response. This eliminated a structured safety mechanism that could have restricted Heinrich's access or provided Stasy with a protection strategy. Several potential support structures existed, including Domestic Violence Advocacy Center within a 5-mile radius, 24-hour crisis hotline, court-connected liaison service, employer wellness program, community legal clinics. Records show she did not engage with any of these resources after initial inquiry. No mandatory follow-up was implemented. Support services were available but not accessed. Outreach efforts were not proactive. They relied on the victim's persistence. Systemic models indicate that victims frequently disengage due to fear or manipulation. Without continued outreach or court-mandated support liaison, the burden of action remains solely on the individual. The case highlights multiple areas requiring reform. Mandatory risk assessment. Any repeat domestic disturbance calls should automatically generate a risk classification review. Extended intervention authority. Law enforcement should have authority to initiate protective mechanisms even if the alleged victim refuses to press charges, based on threat indicators. Centralized incident tracking. All reports involving interpersonal conflict should be aggregated across departments, police, medical, court, for holistic review. Court intervention enforcement. When a protection order is filed, withdrawal or missed hearings must require formal in-person review before closure. Mandatory victim outreach. A follow-up support team should engage within 48 hours of police contact in suspected domestic violence situations. Failure to appear flagging. Non-attendance in court relating to protection should trigger welfare checks instead of administrative dismissal. Training for officers on escalation risk. Intervention should not be limited to visible physical harm but must consider behavioral and circumstantial indicators. Active court-linked counseling requirement. Protective order cases should require counseling and risk education pending resolution. Police intervention occurred in a public parking area following a verbal altercation. Stasy was said to be visibly distressed. Officers engaged in conversation with both parties and then left after confirming no immediate physical threat. No field interview card or escalation report was filed. The silence after departure is significant. It indicates the end of official oversight. Within minutes, the fatal act was carried out, occurring outside the view of any authority. Following the officer's exit, the environment remained unmonitored. No surveillance unit remained present. No welfare observer stayed on site. The absence of further attention allowed events to proceed without interruption. The parking lot, once temporarily secured by presence, was left without active protection. The silence symbolized the gap between intervention and prevention. Earlier police calls, medical evidence indicating injury, prior altercations, and court withdrawal were all potential flags. Intervention tools existed but were not engaged effectively. Legal mechanisms requiring continuation of risk assessment even without confirmed victim participation did not trigger. Based on available case annotations, multiple predictive markers preceded the final event. However, without enforcement, these markers remained unutilized. Reform must target immediate action during enforcement interactions, not dependent upon voluntary victim engagement during high-risk climates. Awareness must shift from identifying harm only post-incident to recognizing behavioral risk patterns. Accountability requires assessing system failure rather than concluding individual oversight alone. The sequence of events leading to the incident demonstrates where advanced intervention may have prevented escalation. This case should serve as a procedural reference. The silence in the parking lot following the departure of law enforcement should not represent the end of oversight. Legal systems must be adjusted to extend protection beyond direct engagement, ensuring immediate safety continuation. Her story precedes necessary structural changes. The objective is not to revisit events but to transform responses moving forward. This case functions as a point of reference for change, highlighting the need for early escalation protocols, persistent outreach mechanisms, and legal consequences upon multiple threat indicators. The analysis reveals that the case did not lack opportunity for intervention but lacked activation of such opportunities. The absence of continued engagement represents a preventable lapse. The narrative closes not in emotion but in procedural clarity. Without enacted reform, similar outcomes remain probable. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions.